Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be the second part of our histology lecture for chapter 5. So in part 1, we discussed epithelium tissue. So let's go ahead and continue on with the fun, and let's take a look at connective tissue, nervous tissue, as well as muscular tissue. Now, one of the unique things about connective tissue is that unlike the epithelium tissue that we just saw in part 1, connective tissue doesn't like cells that make a lot of physical contact. You will see the appearance of the cells within this particular tissue, but you're going to notice that oftentimes the cells are very spaced out from each other, and they're surrounded by lots of matrix, which is the background. You will also see the appearance of lots of fibers. Fibers under the microscopes often appear as small pieces of thread mixed into the background. Connective tissue is the most abundant tissue type that we have in our body. It is best known for playing a very important role in protecting, connecting, and supporting our organs. And as I mentioned to you before, most of its cells will not make direct contact with each other. Instead, connective tissue will have more focus on what's happening in the background, in the matrix, and it will also rely on different fibers, which we're going to discuss in just a little bit. So little threads you'll see all over the place. And also very important to point out is that connective tissue is highly vascular. Lots and lots of blood vessels can be found. This is also the part where I have to put a little bit of a disclaimer, which is that the cartilage types, which also fall under connective tissue, they do not follow the rule of being very vascular. In fact, they have few, if any, blood vessels. Now here are the fibers that I was mentioning to you before. These are going to be unique to the connective tissue. The fibers are going to look like pieces of thread, and don't worry, pictures are coming up soon so we can take a look at all this. These fibers can be classified into 3 categories. You're going to have the collagen fiber. These are the most abundant. Collagen tends to be very tough, stretch resistant, and flexible. So you're going to notice that all the tissues that have collagen fibers tend to have a very unique, a very tough, abrasion proof quality to it. So we're going to find it mostly in like tendons and ligaments. Then you have your reticular fibers. Reticular fibers form more of a framework. So they're going to be found in areas like your spleen, your lymph nodes, and these tend to be thin collagen fibers, and because of the glycoprotein that kind of surrounds it, it helps with forming a meshwork or a framework. So you tend to find them more on the outer surface of the organ that you're looking at. And then the third one, it all says it in the name, elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are thinner than the other 2 fibers, but they're also more stretchable. Stretching basically means that you can elongate them and they will return back to their original shape. So it will give the tissue a very flexibility type of feel. And part of that is because of the elastin protein that's embedded within the fibers. All right, now just a quick little FYI. When we did our epithelium tissue, we basically concentrated on the arrangement of the cell as well as the individual cell shape, right? So we had things like simple squamous epithelium, stratified columnar epithelium, pseudostratified, transitional epithelium. And that's because in epithelium tissue, the cells are all connected to each other. So they like to make contact, they like to interact. In connective tissue, which is what we're looking at over here now, you're going to notice that the cells are very much spread apart, and there's going to be a lot of emphasis on what's happening in the matrix, in the background. So for instance, here is the first example. This one is called areolar tissue. This is a form of connective tissue. Notice how the name itself doesn't tell us anything about the cell shape or the arrangement, so we're going to have to look for other unique markers. In areolar tissue, I'm going to notice that the cells, here you go, notice how they're not physically connecting to each other. The cells are surrounded by lots of matrix, which is the background, and you will also find lots of collagen fibers, as well as a little bit of elastic fibers within your areolar tissue. Now, I've also, very similar to the epithelium tissue, I went ahead and highlighted the locations that I want you to concentrate on when it's time to study for the exam. I want you to be able to tell me that areolar tissue is an example of connective tissue. I want you to be able to tell me that you can find it underneath the epithelium, which is underneath the skin, and also between muscles. Those are the two most common spaces for areolar tissue. The next one is reticular tissue. Notice how very similar to areolar tissue, this one also has lots of threads. However, notice how the threads stain differently, and that's because reticular tissue, true to its name, has lots of reticular fibers. So remember, the reticular fibers tend to be found within the meshwork or the framework. So you're going to notice that I wrote down for you at the bottom, it will form the supported stroma, which is the framework of the lymphatic organs. So that's why the reticular fibers are so essential in reticular tissue. And if we're looking for additional locations, we're going to look at the spleen and the thymus. There are also some cells that you will find. Notice once again how the cells are spread out and they're not making contact. How about this one? This one is called dense regular connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue gets its name from the fact that it's full of collagen fibers that are organized in a very symmetrical or parallel format. So it almost looks like it's making waves. You can see the little cells peeking out. They went ahead and they labeled the nuclei here in purple. Now, dense regular connective tissue, because it's so full of these parallel collagen fibers, it's going to be an excellent place where we can have lots of abrasions or shock that can be absorbed. So for instance, we're going to take a look at it in the tendons because they tend to attach muscles to bone, and in the ligaments because they tend to hold the bones together. So they're able to be exposed to high stress areas and do well because of the abundance of collagen fibers. Now, dense regular means that the collagen fibers are very organized in a symmetrical pattern. Now, what if I tell you that the next one is going to be called dense irregular connective tissue? How do you think the collagen fibers will vary in that one? Here you go. And if you said the collagen fibers would just be dispersed all over the place, you are 100% correct. So here is our dense irregular connective tissue. Once again, we're going to have lots and lots of collagen fibers. But now instead of being symmetrical, they're very abstract, randomly arranged all over the place, but still excellently found for being able to withstand any type of stresses due to the flexibility and the toughness of the collagen fibers. So for the location for the dense irregular, we're going to go ahead and focus on the deeper layer of the skin. Okay, so randomly arranged collagen fibers withstand stresses, thank you collagen, and its location is going to be within the deeper layer of skin. All right, and here's another connective tissue that completely looks different from all the ones we've seen thus far. This is good old adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, most of us probably just know it as fat. Adipose tissue is full of adipocytes, which are the individual fat cells. They're layered on top of each other. Adipose tissue has many different functions in the body. One of them is for energy storage. It also helps keep us warm, so insulation, and of course cushioning, padding to the body itself. It helps keep the organs kind of packed together, and it kind of gives them a nice little protective layer around them. Now, take a look at your illustration, and I want you to look at your little adipocytes, your individual cells, and if you were to describe them, I think many of us would kind of say, well, they kind of look like a circular structure. And it turns out that the adipocyte is actually the outline of the circular structure. This on the inside, this is its lumen. This is its storage unit. And what we see happening is that most of us have the same amount of epidocytes. We have the same amount of fat cells. But what ends up happening is that those of us who are heavier, we see that those epidocytes are larger. So as you continue to maybe excessively eat, listen, I'm a big girl myself, I love to eat myself. So what we see happening is when we eat too much, our cells will store all this extra food, and when they do that, the epidocytes will swell up, and as they swell up, they enlarge, and then we get larger. And then one day if we say enough, we're going to eat less, we're going to exercise more, what we see happening is that the epidocytes start to shrivel down, and as they shrivel down, so do we start losing weight and getting smaller. The cells never disappear, they either just get smaller or larger depending on genetics, lifestyle changes, and all that other good stuff. Either way, for your adipose tissue, just keep in mind that a lot of it will help you with your energy storage, your insulation, and your cushioning. I did not highlight a particular location for adipose tissue. The one that's pictured is by the breast, and the reason for that is because, as you know, fat tissue can be found in a wide range of areas. All right, so let's take a look now at the hyaline, at the hyaline cartilages. Remember, the cartilages will have very few, if any, blood vessels. They're also going to look very different because they'll have a thicker matrix, and in the matrix itself, we're going to see lots of chondrocytes. The chondrocytes are the cell types that we will find in the cartilages, and they're going to be housed in what we like to call a lacunae, a little dip. So as the chondrocytes, so the chondrocytes are the mature cells, they start off being called chondroblasts. As the chondroblasts build the matrix, eventually they kind of get stuck in the hardened environment that they're secreting. And then when they get stuck in a little lacunae, a little dip. So on your illustration, you see these little white structures. Those are little dips. And as you can see, the cell, pictured in purple for its nucleus, sits inside of the lacunae. It sits inside of the housing. When it gets stuck in the lacunae, it then is called a chondrocyte, no longer a chondroblast, because it's now mature, and the cell is still alive, and it will monitor the matrix to make sure if it needs to be rebuilt or repaired or whatnot. All right, let's see what I wrote down for you. So I wrote hyaline cartilage has lots of collagen fibers. It eases joint movement. It holds the airway open, moves vocal cords, growth of juvenile long bone. Bone actually starts off as hyaline cartilage before it's transformed into bone, or replaced in bone, I should say. And as you can see right here for the location, I wrote down for you 3 items: the trachea, which is your windpipe, so that goes to your lungs, your larynx, which is your voice box, and then the fetal skeleton. So that's the skeleton that we see developing within babies. And that kind of makes sense because, as I said to you before, hyaline cartilage is the first one before it's replaced by bone. Another cartilage type is elastic cartilage. And I just noticed that this picture is wrong. So I'm going to go ahead, and you won't see it, as I'm going to save a picture for you so that on the video, as you're looking at it, you'll have it. I won't see it on my end, but I'll fix it for you. Either way, elastic cartilage gets its name because it's filled with elastic fibers. And the elastic fibers are going to give lots of flexibility to the area where you can find it. So probably the best example is your external ear. All of us can kind of grab our external ear, our little pinna, and we can kind of fold our ear over. And when you let it go, bloop, it plops back into its original shape. And that's all due to elastic cartilage. All right, how about one more? Fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is best known for the fact that it has bundles upon bundles of collagen fibers mixed in with the matrix and the chondrocytes. And once again, the collagen fibers are going to be excellent because they're going to help us resist and absorb a lot of shock and compression. So we're going to find it in areas like the pubic symphysis, which basically sits between the hip bones, the meniscus of the knees, and the intervertebral discs. These are little discs that stack in between the vertebra, which are the bones that make up your back. Now, speaking of bone, compact bone is actually also an example of connective tissue. As you can see, compact bone, when you look at it under the microscope, looks like little tree trunks that have been sawed in half. And the individual circular structures, let me just kind of circle in for you. These are called osteons. These are the individual units of the compact bone. In the middle, you have a darkened area because that's the central canal. We also call it the Haversian canal. That one's very important because that's where all the blood vessels and the nerves are. And then surrounding the central canal, you'll have these little lamellas, these little circular patterns, and they will house these little black dots that you can see. The little black dots are lacunae. Remember what I was telling you? Lacunae are little dips that the cells will sit in. Well, the cells in this case are called osteocytes. Mature bone cells, starting off as osteoblasts, then they become osteocytes. Either way, the osteocytes will sit within the lacunae, and they will monitor the overall shape and structure of the compact bone. And I'm going to actually leave that here for bone because we do have multiple chapters that are coming up that will discuss bone in a lot more greater detail. So we'll talk more about how all the nutrient from the central canal or the Haversian canal will travel down through these little canaliculus to the individual lacunae, so to make sure that the osteocyte have enough nutrients and of course can get rid of their waste products. And probably everybody's most interesting choice when we talk about connective tissue is when I tell them that blood is actually also an example of connective tissue. So when you take a look at blood, whether you're looking at the red blood cells, the white blood cells, or the platelets, collectively a blood smear is an example of connective tissue. It is the only liquid tissue that we have. All of them are not, all the rest of them obviously, like the adipose, hyaline cartilage, dense regular, these are all solid tissue types. So blood is, even though it's liquid, is still classified as a tissue, and in our case it's an example of connective tissue. Alrighty, so that is the end of our connective tissue. So now we just have two more items to look at, and these are going to go relatively quickly because they don't have as much details or examples as the connective tissue. They're going to be our nervous and muscular tissue. And we can discuss these two tissues together because they share some of the same qualities, including the fact that they're excitable. Excitable means that they're able to generate a response when they receive a stimuli. So for instance, if you excite a muscle, it will contract. If you excite a neuron, a nerve cell, it will often send off an electrical chemical signal for you to pick up. And this is all due to the fact that the cell membrane has a membrane potential, which means it's able to generate an electrical charge that will vary internally and externally from the cell. And depending on the stimulus that's received, it will once again give a response by generating a membrane potential. So here it says for you in nerve cells, if you change the voltage, you can have a rapid transmission of signals. So you're going to release neurotransmitters. And in muscle cells, we can see we can use that excitability to get the muscles to respond or to contract. Other way of saying exciting is to get it to contract. All right, so let's take a look at the nervous tissue. Now, the nervous tissue is exclusively going to be found within the nervous system. So we're taking a look at like our brain and our spinal cord. We really only have two cell types to discuss here. The first one are the main cells, which are going to be the neurons. You can see it here on the smear, this large structure right here. This is our neuron. The neuron, which are the brain cells and the nervous tissue cells, they will be able to detect any type of stimuli and respond to it appropriately. When you look at the structure, you're going to notice that the neuron itself will have a central area called the neurosoma. That's where you find the nucleus. It will have multiple dendrites Dendrites are where it receives its stimuli from. So all the messages come in through the dendrites and go into the neurosoma. And once the cell knows what to do, its result or its signal is sent down its axon. There's only one axon. So you can have multiple dendrites, but only one axon. So the dendrites receive, and the axons then translate or transmit the message. Surrounding the neuron, you're going to see that there are lots of smaller little cells. These are called your glial cells or neuroglial cells. They vastly outnumber the amount of neurons that we have. I think the last count I saw was 1,000 to 1. So for every 1,000 glial cells, we have one neuron cell. The glial cells are housekeeper cells. They are the ones that will protect and assist the neurons. When we get to the nervous tissue chapter, we're going to talk about how the neurons are able to transmit that message. And what we see happening is that the glial cells will be able to speed up that message by myelinating around the axon. So they are extremely essential in protecting and assisting the neurons. Now, for the muscle cells, for muscular tissue, we're going to have 3 examples we're going to need to know. The first one is going to be skeletal muscle, which is what we're looking at. Then we're going to also take a look at cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So those are the 3 muscle types that we have: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal muscle is most known for the fact that it will attach to the bones. Also, it will allow us for things like moving our arms and our legs, facial expressions. Skeletal muscle is an example of voluntary muscle, right over here. And voluntary basically means that on a conscious level, we're able to control when that muscle contracts and relaxes. So for instance, if you look at your hand, you can now decide to make a fist. And when you make a fist, you're contracting your fingers. You're doing that on a conscientious level. So you're consciously controlling when it's contracting. And you can also go ahead and tell it when to relax. So it's under voluntary control. When we take a look at it under the microscope, we also see that skeletal muscle is striated. And striated means that if I take a look at my muscle, and I'm going to come over here, the first thing I'm going to notice is that my muscle is composed of different fibers. So here's one fiber, here's one block, here's a second one, here's a third, and here's a fourth. So these fibers kind of lay on top of each other. You're also going to notice that it has multiple nuclei. Here are the purple ones. And then here you have these perpendicular lines. These perpendicular lines that run in a very organized fashion, those are the striations. So whenever you see those perpendicular lines, you can say it's a striated muscle type. There are 2 striated muscle types. Skeletal muscle is one. Cardiac muscle is going to be the next. In fact, spoiler alert, smooth muscle gets its name because it doesn't have any striations. So the organized parallel fibers, which are actually actin and myosin, we're going to talk more about them in chapter 11. If it's nicely organized, it makes those striations, which you can find in skeletal muscle as well as in cardiac muscle. Speaking of cardiac muscle, as I mentioned to you before, it is striated, so it has those perpendicular lines. You can see them right here in the muscle fibers. It is involuntary, which means on a conscious level, you do not control when it contracts or relaxes. The nervous system will take care of all of that. Cardiac muscle is exclusively found in the heart. So it's a good thing we don't have to consciously think about when to have the heart beat, right? Your body takes care of that, so that's another word you don't have to think about. Let's see. When you look at cardiac muscle, in addition to knowing that it's in the heart, that it's striated, just like skeletal, that it's involuntary, I also want you to know that it has this unique feature called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs are when the cardiomyocytes, which are your heart cells, basically line up end to end and they create a thick border. This is where lots of electrical and mechanical connections occur. In fact, if you take a look at your illustration under A, you're going to see that some of the striations have a darker color. Let me circle this one. Here's another one. There's another one. Here's a whole bunch of them. Now, all the striations that are darker in color, those are the intercalated discs. And those are unique to cardiac muscle. So skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle will both have striations, but only the cardiac muscle will have the intercalated discs. All right, how about this one? This is our last muscle tissue, smooth muscle. I kind of spoiled the surprise before when I told you that smooth muscle does not have striations. It does have the actin and the myosin. However, they are not organized in a parallel format. They are all over the place, which allows for the muscles to not appear striated under the microscope. Smooth muscle is often what makes up our internal organs. So we could see right here, it says it's a visceral muscle. So it will help make up the organs, whether we're looking at the walls or the entirety of it. It is under involuntary control, meaning once again that the nervous tissue will take care of all its contracting and relaxing. You do not have to worry about it on a conscious level. All right, so just to wrap it up, we had our nervous tissue, which for the nervous tissue, just please know that the neurons and the glial cells are the two cells you find in there, exclusively to our nervous system. And then we had our muscular tissue, and that's going to be the skeletal, the smooth, and the cardiac muscle. And of course, you had your hands full of connective tissue at the start of part 2 of this lecture. One last thing I want to discuss with you before we wrap up chapter 5, I want to talk to you about what we call cell junctions. Okay, so since our body is made out of trillions of cells, there has to be a way for these cells to interact with each other, especially, for instance, when we take a look at epithelium tissue, where the cells are kind of forced to kind of stack either in one layer, multiple layer, or whatnot. So if you see that the cell is making physical connection, we're talking about cell junctions, so meeting points between the cells. And it turns out that the 3 most common ones are a tight junction, a desmosome, or a gap junction. Okay, a tight junction means that when the cells adhere to each other, so when they connect to each other, they create an impermeable connection. It's almost like we're super gluing the area together between the 2 plasma membranes, so the cells are neighbors, but they're not interacting with each other any other way. So here, for instance, you could see the yellow is stacked next to each other. There is nothing going on. It is just a tight junction. Now, the other option is what we like to call desmosomes, which are also called anchoring junction. And they get the name because the 2 cells will anchor off each other. So here you can see that they're interacting through each other. They will have these self-adhesion proteins that will allow them to interact the 2 cells together. Now notice how there's a gap, and that's because the desmosomes will form little anchoring junctions that will allow the cells to kind of stretch apart from each other and then come back to their original position. So it gives a little bit of flexibility to the connection. So you had your tight connection, which is just physical connection, non-permeable. You have your desmosomes, which means that I'm anchoring and I'm able to tug and come back to its original location. And then the third one is a gap junction. In gap junctions, as you can see, we almost make these little hole punches, these little channels that allow the cells not only to connect to each other, but also to share cytoplasmic content. So things like chloride, potassium, calcium, these little ions can freely float from one cell into the next cell, because of the formation of this little pore, this little opening in our gap junction. Alrighty, so those are the 3 most common types of cell junctions, how cells interact or connect to each other. Either they do a tight connection, meaning they're just physically connected, nothing is happening, no interaction between the 2 of them. They can do a desmosome, which is called an anchoring junction or an anchoring connection, meaning that there's some flexibility. They can stretch and come back. Or they can do a gap junction. A gap junction means that there's a pore, there's a little channel that allows them to share cytoplasmic content. So what's happening on the inside of the cell from one cell to the next. Now, having said that, I'm going to go ahead and end chapter 5 over here. If you have any questions, comments, and concerns, please do not hesitate and email me, and then we shall talk soon in our next chapter. Enjoy the rest of your day.